Welcome back. We're going to be talking about the structure now of the epidermis, or of the skin. So there are two major regions of the skin, and that is the epidermis and the dermis. But we always talk about a third region, though it's not actually part of the integumentary system. It's talked about here. This is the only area that really would fit in. So it's known as the hypodermis. The hypodermis is your subcutaneous layer. So this is a layer of tissue comprised almost completely of fat or adipose tissue, but it also has some areolar connective tissue associated with it. And its function is anchoring our skin to underlying organs so that our skin doesn't just slough off. We're going to focus though, I told you about this one, so we're going to look at the epidermis and then the dermis. So if you look here, you can see the epidermis, which is this upper layer. Doesn't look like a really thick region. This is stratified squamous epithelium. The lower levels of tissue are all living, but the upper levels are all dead tissue. So this tissue that sloughs off from us daily is actually dead tissue. Deep to our epidermis is our dermis. The dermis actually has two major parts to it. It has a papillary layer, which is composed of the areolar connective tissue, which feeds our integument or our epidermis. And then we have a reticular layer, which is the deeper part, which is composed of predominantly dense irregular connective tissue. And then down here you can see that subcutaneous layer with all the fat. And within this, you can see a lot of different accessory organs, which we'll talk about, including like your sweat glands, your sebaceous glands, your erector pili muscles, which control your hair, hair follicles, then blood vessels, and nerves. So the epidermis itself is the outermost layer open to the external environment. It is a very tough membrane, also known as your cutaneous membrane, composed of stratified squamous epithelium, and it is keratinized. So the most common cell type is a keratinocyte, which produces keratin. It is completely avascular, so it needs to gain nutrients from underlying basement membrane, which is known as areolar connective tissue. There are 5 main layers to the epidermis. So when you look here, you can see that the deepest layer is called the stratum basal. This is oftentimes thought of as the germinative layer because it's the layer that undergoes mitosis readily. Then you have a thick layer of spinosum, stratum spinosum. The deepest region of the spinosum can also undergo mitosis, but as you move up in stratum spinosum, you're not going to be able to undergo mitosis anymore. Then we have the stratum granulosum. This is the layer where the cells start to die off. They get filled with the keratin, so you're producing keratin continuously, and as keratin builds up in the cell ends up dying. Stratum lucidium, which is only found in thick skin. Thick skin is located on the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet. Stratum lucidium is a clear, thick, extra protective layer. And then we have the stratum corneum, which is the most superficial, and this is the layer that's constantly sloughing off. So as tissue moves, as tissue is produced, it moves from each of these layers, and then it sloughs off. So every month, we have an entirely new integument, or epidermis. So you know how snakes shed their skin, spiders shed their skin, and they shed one large skin, and then they come out of that old skin with a brand new skin. We do the same thing, but we shed it continuously day after day, and so we're just shedding pieces off all the time, which is what makes up the dust that we breathe in. So the majority of our dust that is around us is actually our own dead skin cells. Kind of creepy, right? And fun. So let's talk about each of these layers a little bit more thoroughly. And actually, hold on, I'm going to get a picture up, okay? All right, so here's the really cool picture that I wanted to put up. I'm going to talk about the different uh, regions or the different layers from this picture. I also am going to talk about some of the different cell types on here. So we have 5 basic cell types that you can see. So right here, this is called a Merkel cell. Merkel cells are your sensory cells that take in different type of sensory information and send that information through our nerves to our brain so that we can then interpret that as light touch, deep touch, or maybe it's a pressure, or maybe it's going to be a temperature sensation. We have these germinative cells. So you see here these cells that undergo mitosis all the time. We have stem cells that produce new keratinocytes undergoing mitosis. We have stem cells that produce new keratinocytes. They're all in this basal layer. And then we have these melanocytes. Melanocytes are the ones that produce melanin, which I'll talk about in just a couple minutes. So that's all in this basal layer. The basal layer is the layer that undergoes mitosis continually. And the reason it can is because it's gaining nutrients through the diffusion of nutrients from the areolar connective tissue basement membrane. The next layer, so we only have one layer of cells in that basal layer. Then we have multiple layers of cells in the stratum spinosum. All of these cells are living cells. The lowest layers can actually undergo mitosis still because they're also able to gain nutrients. The spinosum layer then is the layer in which the cells start producing keratin continuously. So there's here some living keratinocytes producing lots and lots of keratin. Within this layer, we also have these epidermal dendritic cells. Dendritic cells are immune system cells that recognize the invasion of bacteria or viruses and send signals to our immune system. The next layer is the stratum granulosum. So this is a layer where the cells start to flatten out. So if you look down here, we have more cuboidal shape, but this is stratified squamous, so they're all flattened at the top. They start to flatten out here, and organelles start to break down. So this is where the cells start to die. By the time they hit the next layer, they're going to be dead cells. So granulosum is where cells actually die. Then this is thin skin. You know it's thin skin because thin skin also contains hair follicles. Thick skin would have a layer called stratum lucidium, where we have this extra thick layer of tissue for protection. And then we have the stratum corneum. These are all dead keratinocytes that are held together very tightly. They are water resistant. They are very protective. And then as we produce new cells down here, these upper layers start to slough off. All right, so at this point, you should be able to tell me the tissue types that make up the integument, what the 3 regions of the integument are, the epidermis, dermis, and the subcutaneous layer. What the major organs of the integumentary system are. So skin is the major organ, as well as we have lots of different accessory structures, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. What the functions are of the integumentary system, like protection and production of calcitriol. The different cell types, which we talked about, from Merkel cells and melanocytes and keratinocytes and dendritic cells and stem cells, and the different layers of the epidermis. So stratum basal, spinosum, granulosum, lucidium, if it's thick skin, and corneum. The next region then is the dermis. The dermis is composed of connective tissue, and it's directly under your epidermis. There are two major parts to the dermis. The first is known as the papillary layer. This is the upper region, and it's called the papillary layer because it produces these little papilla. So these papilla actually have a really important function. They form friction ribbons, friction ridges. And friction ridges are better known as your fingerprints. And then we have the reticular layer. So the reticular layer is the deeper layer formed by dense irregular connective tissue. This is the layer that has, well, both have lots of blood vessels, but this layer has a lot of blood vessels, has both sweat and oil glands, and has some deep pressure receptors associated with it. So here's a light micrograph of the integumentary. This top region here, way up here, are all those dead keratinocytes. Down here you can see living keratinocytes in the epidermis. And then down here we have the papillary layer forming those papilla. And then way deep is the reticular layer. So this layer is formed mainly by areolar connective tissue, which makes up the basement membrane of all of your epithelium. And then deeper is dense irregular connective tissue, both highly vascular tissues. Last thing I'll talk about in this lecture is pigment or skin color. So skin color has three major contributing factors. The main factor would be melanin. Melanin is the protein produced by your melanocytes. Melanin can form a dark pigment or a more lighter red pigment depending on the type, your genes, which is determined by your genes. Carotene, which is a vitamin that is found, it's a pigment, but it's produced by specific vitamins, vitamin A specifically, and it's found in yellow-orange vegetables, so like your carrots or squash have a lot of carotene in them. And then hemoglobin, which is the oxygen binding molecule in blood, which forms that reddish coloring of blood. And the amount of oxygen will determine how red that coloring is. So let's look at melanin. That's probably the most important of the three contributing factors to skin color. Melanin is produced by melanocytes. There are two major types of melanin. Eumelanin is the darker pigmented melanin, so it forms that dark brown to black coloration. Pheomelanin is a lighter pigmented melanin, forming more of a yellow or red coloration. So our melanocytes are found deep within the epidermis in that stratum basal layer. Melanocytes produce melanin mainly in response to UV radiation. So the more radiation that comes in, the more melanin we will produce. So the amount of melanin we have is going to be associated with both the genetics that we have, so the type of melanin by the genetics, and the amount of UV radiation, the amount of melanin, which is why your skin color gets darker when you are in the sunlight, because melanin's function is to protect people from the UV radiation. But melanin can break down, melanocytes can break down relatively quick in response to UV radiation, and that is also why you have to worry about things like skin cancers. Carotene. So carotene is a pigment that is found in specific types of vegetables. So carotene is converted into a vitamin called vitamin A. Vitamin A is a fat-soluble vitamin, which means it dissolves in fat. And so you've probably heard people say that you can't take certain vitamins, too much of them, they'll build up and they can become toxic. That's because if they're water-soluble vitamins, they go right through your system and you pee them out. But if it's a fat-soluble vitamin, it can sit in the adipose tissue that you have. And that can be dangerous for certain vitamins, but with carotene, it's not so dangerous. So what carotene does is it sits in the subcutaneous layer, and then it causes your skin to turn an orangey color. So not super bad. So the function of vitamin A, it plays a role in your immune system. It produces, or it's an antioxidant. Antioxidants are beneficial because they bind free radicals so that free radicals don't damage your cells. Another thing that vitamin A is really important for is it forms certain proteins in our eyes called retinols, and retinols are needed for sight. If I can get it to come up, there we go. So in countries where vitamin A is lacking, so if you're not getting enough orange and yellow vegetables, you're not getting enough vitamin A in your diet, these people are going blind because they don't have the retinols forming to be able to take in the light energy and convert it to figure or to picture what they're supposed to see. So we have actually produced special rice called golden rice. Golden rice contains the vitamins in the rice itself, and these people then don't go blind because now they have those vitamins that they need. But too much vitamin A or too much carotene, and your skin can actually turn orange. So there's an example of vitamin A toxicity, which is not that big of a deal. It's just an orange pigment. The last molecule that influences our pigment is hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is that oxygen binding molecule inside of red blood cells. It actually, the more oxygen bound, the redder it becomes. And so we tend to turn very red when our blood vessels open up, vasodilate. This causes the blood to run to the surface of our skin and makes us look redder. So when does this typically happen? If you're thinking about it, hopefully, I'm waiting a second. I know, I realize that I'm probably, that's another story. I'm hoping that you're thinking about it and you're coming up with the fact that when you're exercising, when you're really hot, these are times when you tend to turn red. Well, the reason for that is when we have a lot of heat in our body being produced, say from exercise or from a buildup of heat because it's hot outside, then the blood vessels near the surface of our skin dilate, allowing the blood to move to the surface of the skin and allow that heat to escape to the surface. At that point, then that temperature change at the skin will actually stimulate or send a signal to tell our sweat glands to release sweat. And the sweat glands will then release sweat to the surface of the skin, and we will then, the sweat will evaporate, and when it evaporates, it takes with it that heat, which is what cools the body down. Pretty cool, right? All right, so at this point, you should be able to tell me the two major regions of the dermis, and you should be able to tell me how melanin, carotene, and hemoglobin contribute to skin color. I'm going to stop here. This has been almost a 20-minute video, so I apologize for how long it is. And I'll pick it up in the next video. Bye.